Hi, I'm Keek, and welcome to Countdown to Catastrophe, a video series where we explore the historical processes that brought us to our present-day predicament. Today we're talking about the state, we're talking about violence, and we're talking about the American Revolution again. So our modern understanding of states goes back to 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia. The treaty is sort of seen as the beginning of an era in international politics where politics are defined as the relationship between states who have complete sovereignty over a given territory where they have exclusive right to rule. So what then defines a state? Max Weber, or Weber if you're not an defined the state as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Laws, then, just a collection of words, are enforced through violence. As Jacques Derrida noted on law enforcement, quote, "The word enforceability reminds us that there is no such thing as law that does not imply in itself the possibility of being enforced." Without violence, then, there are no laws and there is no state. States are founded on what Derrida calls originary violence. If he was less of an asshole, he would have just called it original violence, but he's not. Summing up this concept, critical race theorist Richard Delgado wrote, "While violence enacted by various states today differ broadly, each, including the subsequently peaceable ones, was violent in its originary founding act." Consider the political economic system of slavery that was inseparable from the American Revolution. 20% of the workforce by 1776 were enslaved Africans. These people were permanently relegated to a lower class than even those of indentured white servants. Slavery, of course, was a horribly violent institution. Not only was the genocide of the indigenous population integral to the American Revolution, it was accelerated by it. Indigenous people bore the brunt of revolutionary violence. As Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz notes, throughout the war between separatist settlers and the forces of the monarchy, armed settlers waged total war against indigenous people. Between 1492 and 1900, some 12 million people died directly as a result of the arrival of white settlers into what is today the United States of America. Enshrined in the Constitution is settler colonial violence. With the Second Amendment, settler militias and armed households were institutionalized, effectively sanctioning, quote, "the destruction and controls of native peoples, communities, and nations." Also, prior to the Revolution, another set of militias had begun to organize for a different purpose in the American South. So-called slave patrols, employed by colonial courts, were tasked with both apprehending fugitive enslaved people as well as detaining free black people. The Second Amendment also federally sanctioned these patrols. The violent nature of the state is what defines any economic system where private property is the cornerstone. For that reason, in 1840, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon famously stated, "Property is robbery!" This just seems to be the case if property law is enforced in the same violent way in which all other laws are enforced. Quick note to all the haters out there. There's a difference between private property and personal property, in philosophy at least. What I'm talking about is private property is something in the economy that individuals own and other people produce value from. So in a capitalist system, we have private ownership over the means of production. No one's saying you can't have personal property. You can't have your clothes or the car that you drive. You're not making someone else's money off of personal property. Violence and the interests of capital are wholly inseparable from the United States. William Z. Foster, in the same vein as Herbert Aptheker, who we talked about in the last video, characterized the American Revolution as a violent economic, political, and military collision between the young colonial capitalism striving to grow and acquire independence and the dominant British capitalism which sought to stifle and restrict it. This helps us understand how it came to be that the Constitution disproportionately gave power to slave owners. Prior to the creation of the Electoral College, it was agreed upon at the Constitutional Convention that congressional representation would depend on the number of freed people in a state, the number of indentured servants, and, quote, 3/5 of all other persons, the enslaved population. The Electoral College, the total of all congressional representation between the House and the Senate, inevitably gave way more power to the planters in the South. Not to mention, the federal institution of property law with the Fifth Amendment in the Bill of Rights lent itself to the institution of slavery, as the fate of enslaved individuals could be determined within a federal framework. It allowed for nationwide mandates like the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Now, the reason we have the Constitution really comes out of a moment of crisis for the privileged elite. The military mobilization that liberated that elite from monarchical control also made it difficult for them to rule hereditarily as feudal lords like they wanted. Charles Lindholm and John Hall write, America was born amidst a dose of political cleansing that removed a large proportion of its potentially aristocratic elements. There was great unrest also amongst the lower classes of people. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 was of the more conservative constitutions in North America. It was written by John Adams. It held property qualifications for voting. The governor had veto power over legislation. Massachusetts also had a pretty onerous tax policy on its citizens, many of whom lacked representation, which is crazy.
Sound familiar?
Taxation without representation. In 1785, Governor James Boyden was elected, coming into office with a strict tax enforcement agenda. The next year, new taxes were levied against primarily farmers, leading to armed rebellion to break out. Michael Klarman writes, quote, their protests reflected not just their specific grievances with high taxes and unimaginable debt, but also a more general resentment towards an Eastern elite that they felt was determined to impose aristocratic rule upon them. Klarman continues on what was called Shays' Rebellion. It played a critical role in the creation of the Constitution. The events in Massachusetts were, according to one of Madison's correspondents, truly deplorable and distressing indeed. For this reason and others, Charles A. Beard notes, at the very outset, the public was excluded from any input into what was happening at the Constitutional Convention. The Articles of Confederation left too much power in the hands of the states, which oftentimes failed to adequately protect property. Prior to 1913, when the 17th Amendment to the Constitution was established, senators were appointed by state legislatures. It's for this reason that the senators exercise more power, as there's only two in each state, than their counterparts in the House of Representatives. Gustavus Myers also gives credence to economic motivations behind the establishment of our federal institutions. It was his contention that,
of course that's your contention, you're a first-year grad student,
the iron laws designed to shackle the working class prior to the Revolution continued or were supplemented by others equally rigid. Myers notes that there was, quote, popular bitterness manifested against the courts, based on more than a century of judges acting, quote, arrogantly and often corruptly, while, quote, landowners or their retainers continued to be put on the bench. He argues that the Founding Fathers' focus on congressional representation diverted attention from the tremendous potential that the Constitution had lodged in a small, omnipotent body appointed for life. And like Beers, he points out that the Founding Fathers had material interests at stake. All of the Founding Fathers owned capital, land, or were slave owners. In the next episode, we're going to look at why it is that people don't really have this understanding of the American Revolution. And if you're trying to get to the bottom of why that is, then you just have to like, comment, and subscribe for more content, and also so that publishers will look twice at my book.